In 1999, Porsche made a choice. They had a Le Mans race engine ready to compete at the world's greatest endurance race, or they could build an SUV to save the company. They chose the SUV. The engine was supposed to die in a parts bin in Stuttgart. Instead, Porsche put it in a road car they knew the world wasn't ready for. They were right. To understand what the Carrera GT actually is, you need to go back to 1991. Not to a racetrack, not to a Porsche engineering lab, but to one of the most embarrassing seasons in Formula One history. The Footwork Arrows team had signed Porsche to build them a V10, 3.5 liters, naturally aspirated, developed by Porsche's racing engine division, the same team responsible for the Tag Porsche Turbo that powered McLaren to back-to-back championship titles in the mid-1980s. On paper, this was serious hardware from serious people. On the track, it was a disaster. The Porsche V12 that preceded it had already been a disaster for footwork in 1991. So heavy and unreliable that the team abandoned it mid-season after just 6 races with 0 points scored. Then came the V10 project for 1992. Before it could prove anything on a racetrack, Footwork ran out of money to sustain the partnership. The V10 was shelved before it ever raced a single Grand Prix. The engine went into storage, not into a race car, not into development, into a parts bin. So there it sat. A naturally aspirated V10 with Formula One, DNA, and nowhere to go, gathering dust for nearly a decade while the rest of the motorsport world moved on. Then something shifted inside Porsche's Le Mans engineering team. In the late 1990s, the ACO introduced new LMP 900 regulations for the 2024 hours of Le Mans, and Porsche wanted back in. Someone on the engineering team pulled the old V10 out of storage and looked at it differently, not as a failed F1 engine, as a starting point. They bored it out from 3.5 liters to 5.5 liters, rebuilt it for endurance performance, and installed it in a Le Mans prototype called the 9R3. The car tested at Monza and Paul Ricard and showed genuine pace. For the first time in almost a decade, the engine had a future. That future lasted about 18 months. In 1999, Porsche's board redirected the company's resources. The Le Mans program was consuming engineering bandwidth and capital that Porsche needed elsewhere. The 911 lineup alone couldn't sustain the business long term. They needed a volume product, something that could sell in the tens of thousands, not the hundreds. The answer was an SUV, the Cayenne. The 9R3 program was canceled before it ever raced at Le Mans. The engine was orphaned a second time. Now here's the irony that runs through this entire story. The Cayenne launched in 2002. Within 3 years, it was generating the revenue that saved Porsche from the financial pressure that nearly killed the company at the turn of the millennium. The SUV that killed the Le Mans dream turned out to be one of the most important vehicles Porsche ever built. Without the Cayenne's revenue, Porsche almost certainly couldn't have funded a low-volume halo car with a race-derived V10 and a full carbon fiber chassis. The car that killed the engine's racing future is exactly what funded its road car future. But that's getting ahead of things. In 1999, all Porsche had was a 5.5-liter V10 that had failed in Formula One and never raced at Le Mans, and a road car engineering team asking a question nobody had seriously considered before. What do you do with a race engine that has nowhere to race? The answer they came up with would produce one of the most technically uncompromising road cars ever built, and one of the most dangerous. The road car team took the 5.5-liter block and bored it out further. 5.7 liters, 612 horsepower at 8,000 RPM. 8,400 RPM redline. No turbochargers, no superchargers, No forced induction of any kind. Just a naturally aspirated V10 screaming toward a red line most road cars never approach. The power doesn't arrive in a wave the way a turbocharged engine delivers it. It builds. Below 4,000 revolutions per minute, the car feels manageable. Above 4,000, something else takes over entirely. To shape how that engine translated into an actual driving experience, Porsche handed the development program to Walter Röhrl. If you don't know the name, here's the short version. Rohrl is one of the greatest rally drivers who ever lived, a two-time World Rally Championship winner who later became Porsche's chief development pilot. He drove everything. He broke everything. And when the Carrera GT was being developed in the early 2000s, he was the man whose feedback determined whether the car was ready. He described the experience of driving it as something that makes you concentrate on the brink of pain. That's not a warning. Coming from Rohrl, that's a compliment. It means the car demands everything and gives everything back. What gave the car that quality started with the architecture. The Carrera GT was one of the first production cars ever built with a full carbon fiber monocoque chassis and carbon subframes at both ends of the car. Not just a carbon tub with aluminum subframes bolted on, which was the compromise most manufacturers made. Full carbon front and rear. This is Formula One construction applied to a road car, and it produces a chassis that communicates everything. Every surface texture, every weight transfer, every shift in grip level travels directly through the structure into the driver's hands and feet without being filtered or softened. But the chassis was only part of what made the car feel the way it does. The bigger factor was how the engine connected to it. The V10 bolts directly to the back of the carbon monocoque as a structural component. It's called a stressed member design, and it's borrowed straight from single-seater racing. The transmission hangs off the back of the engine. There's no separate subframe carrying the drivetrain. The engine itself is part of the structure. What that means in practical terms is that if you remove the V10, the car loses rigidity. The engine isn't just a power source sitting in a bay, it's load-bearing. This is why repairs on a damaged Carrera GT are so expensive, and it's also why the driving feel is so visceral. There's almost no separation between the mechanical components and the person operating them. Then there's the clutch. Porsche fitted the Carrera GT with a ceramic composite clutch, their PCCC system, and it engages in roughly 4 millimeters of pedal travel. 4 millimeters. The margin between a smooth departure and a stalled engine is smaller than the width of your thumb. Porsche knew this was a problem for most drivers, so they offered factory training to new owners specifically for clutch operation. The owners who took the training learned to work with it. The owners who skipped it often burned through a clutch in under 1,000 miles. Replacement cost around $30,000. Porsche could have designed a more forgiving clutch. They didn't. They could have added stability control, traction control, launch control. They added none of it. ABS was the only electronic intervention the car offered. Every other input, every correction, every recovery from a moment of oversteer was down to the driver. That was the choice. And it was deliberate. Would you take a Carrera GT with no traction control or a modern supercar with every electronic safety net? Drop your answer in the comments. Both choices say something about what you want from a car. Porsche built exactly 1,270 Carrera GTs between 2004 and 2006. The original plan called for 1,500, but new US airbag regulations cut the run short. So the number became what it is. 1,270 cars. That's it. Every single one of them left the factory with that same uncompromising architecture, that same 4mm clutch window, that same naturally aspirated V10 waiting above 4,000 RPM to remind you who was in charge. The Widowmaker label came from what happens when those conditions meet the wrong driver. Here's the technical reality without the drama. The V10's power band is linear on the way up, but it builds fast once it arrives. Below 4,000 revolutions per minute, the car feels controllable. Cross that threshold and the rear wheels are carrying 612 horsepower with no traction control, no stability program, and a locking differential that can unload the rear end mid-corner without much warning. The snap happens faster than most drivers can process it, not because the car is broken, because that's exactly how the physics work when you remove every layer of electronic mediation between the engine and the road. Most drivers adapt, given time and respect for what the car is asking. Some don't get that time. The tire problem made it worse as the years went on. The original Michelin Pilot Sport Cup tires the Carrera GT shipped with were engineered for the performance window that existed in the mid-2000s. By the late 2010s, a car sitting in a collection on its original rubber was running on compound that had aged out of its design parameters. Tires degrade even when they're not being driven. The chemical structure of the rubber changes. Grip levels drop. And on a car with no electronic safety net, degraded tires don't just reduce performance, they shift the handling threshold in ways that aren't always obvious until it's too late. On November 30th, 2013, actor Paul Walker died in a crash involving a Porsche Carrera GT in Valencia, California. He was the passenger. Roger Röhrl was driving. Investigators pointed to high speed and 9-year-old tires as contributing factors. The car didn't malfunction. It performed exactly as it was designed to perform, at a speed and on tires that exceeded what the situation could handle. That accident is part of the Carrera GT's history, and it deserves to be named plainly, not as a gotcha, and not as the defining chapter, as the clearest possible example of what happens when the car's demands exceed the conditions surrounding it. The story didn't end there. In 2024, Porsche issued a stop-drive order covering all 489 U.S. market Carrera GTs over a potential suspension failure. Parts shortages pushed the remedy timeline past initial estimates. Most of those cars are currently sitting undrivable in private collections, waiting on components that haven't arrived yet. It's a detail almost no other Carrera GT video has touched, and it says something about what it means to own one of these cars today. If you want more stories like this one, cars that changed the industry in ways nobody saw coming, subscribe. We cover these deep dives every week. When the Carrera GT launched in 2004, it carried a sticker price of approximately $440,000. That was already an extraordinary number. Ferrari's Enzo, its closest contemporary, sold for roughly the same. Both cars were asking buyers to spend nearly $500,000 on something with no stability control, no creature comforts worth mentioning, and a clutch that required a training course to operate without destroying it. The market said yes. 20 years later, clean, low-mileage examples are selling at auction for $1.5 million to $2 million, with exceptional cars pushing higher. The market hasn't just appreciated the Carrera GT, it's tripled it. In a collector landscape where values shift constantly based on trends, regulations, and nostalgia cycles, that trajectory is unusual. It reflects something specific: the recognition that this car represents a category that closed permanently, pull back far enough, and the full shape of the story comes into view. Porsche canceled the Le Mans program in 1999 because the company needed the Cayenne to survive. The Cayenne worked. It generated the revenue that funded Porsche's next decade and gave the road car division the financial room to build a halo product with no volume ambitions and no commercial compromises. The Carrera GT was only possible because the Cayenne existed, Both decisions, the one that felt like a retreat and the one that felt like a statement, turned out to be right. What the Carrera GT left behind goes beyond its own value on the auction block. Every modern supercar with torque vectoring, with stability management, with driver mode selectors that adjust intervention levels, was shaped in part by what cars like this one demonstrated about the limits of human reaction time at high performance levels. The industry didn't add those systems because engineers thought they'd be fun. They added them because the data made the argument for them. Cars without intervention systems at this power level on public roads produced outcomes that the industry eventually decided it wasn't willing to keep accepting. Walter Röhrl shaped the Carrera GT into something that rewarded a driver operating at the outer edge of their ability. The problem was that the outer edge of most drivers' ability sits well below what this car requires. Porsche knew that. They built it anyway. We will not see a manual, naturally aspirated V10 supercar built this way again. Not because the engineering is impossible. The engineering was never the constraint. The constraint is that the industry decided the world wasn't ready for a car that places full responsibility on the driver with no fallback. The Carrera GT proved them right. It also proved that the experience of driving something that demands that much is worth preserving, even if the cars themselves can never be replicated. 1,270 cars, that's the entire run, that's all there is. The Carrera GT was the last supercar built without an apology. It came from a failed F1 engine, a canceled Le Mans program, and an SUV that saved a company. Every safety net in every modern supercar exists partly because of what this one taught the industry about what happens when you remove them all. Walter Röhrl said it best. The Carrera GT makes you concentrate on the brink of pain. Porsche built a car that demanded everything from the driver and refused to forgive anything in return. We're not getting another one. The industry decided we weren't ready. Maybe we never were. What do you think is the last truly analog supercar ever built? Drop it in the comments. And if you want more stories about the cars that changed everything without asking permission, subscribe. We're here every week. And if you want to know why the Lexus LFA was the supercar Toyota knew they'd lose money on, watch this video next.